I apologize, well, for two things. First, I'm too old to use slides, so I'm not going to use slides or overheads. And I apologize for not using equations. Because I think to make progress, you really should use equations. So what I want to, there's a famous painting by Magritte, and it's of a pipe. It's a painting of a pipe, and the title of the, and there's words on the painting. There's a painting of a pipe, and then the title is, "This is not a pipe." So I am not going to talk about the euro. Partly because it's impolite for an American to talk about it, and for the second reason, it's premature. So I'm going to talk about I'm going to talk about some things about the United States. I'm going to tell you some history of the United States that current events that remind me of. So here goes. So my friend Ramon Maramon said, you know, we build dynamic economic models, which are most of the models, like overlapping generations models or recursive competitive equilibrium models, they start at time zero and then they go on to infinity. Actually, you could think of building models that start at minus infinity. But anyway, Ramon Maramon, we start at time zero. So one question is that Ramon Maramon asks us, when is or was time zero? So in any applied problem, that's going to be relevant, and it's relevant today. So at this talk, it's relevant because I have to ask when is time zero. So I'm going to tell you, it's when the American Revolution was won. So I'm going to go back to American victory over the British, which occurred in 1781 or 1783. So, but as you'll see, I can't even start there. So we fought in the 1700s. The United States didn't exist. There were 13 colonies. They were colonies of Great Britain. Being a colony of Great Britain had some obligations, and it had plenty of privileges. Americans didn't like to pay taxes to Britain, and as a consequence of that, especially the commercial interests, we fought a revolution to become independent of Britain. And at the end of the revolution, we put together a constitution, and it's not the constitution that you know. It's our first constitution, and the founding fathers of the United States were sworn to be loyal to this constitution. So the constitution was called the Articles of Confederation. And the way I would think of it is it was Ronald Reagan's dream. It was a constitution. There were 13 independent sovereign states. They were called the states, and state meant state, sovereign state. Those 13 sovereign states had basically they had the monopoly on the use of force within those states, and they had the monopoly on taxes, on the ability to tax. They had a monopoly on the ability to regulate trade. So there were really 13 countries, so think of that. And they were joined in a confederacy. It was the United States of America, under the Articles of Confederation, is this confederation where the sovereignty resides in the states. There's a central government, which actually is just a legislature. It has no court system. It has no executive. It's a Congress, and people at the time described it as a debating society. Okay, so that's the Articles of Confederation, and the reason I said it was Ronald Reagan's dream was it's an institutional arrangement that was designed to prevent the central government from taxing, spending, or borrowing. If you can't tax you cannot borrow. Okay? And so let me tell you what I mean by, since you're economists, since we aspire to be economists, I'll tell you what I mean by an institutional arrangement. And by the way, you should interrupt me and tell me when things are particularly unclear. So, okay. So, okay. So, so we've got to define my terms. And I'm going to tell you an economic agent. What's an economic agent? So what an economic agent is a constrained optimization problem. That's what an economic agent is. What's an institutional setting? Well, it's going to be a description of who, and by the way, who for me is an agent, and an agent is a constrained optimization problem. Who decides, chooses what, when, under what information. So that's what an economist or a political scientist or a game theorist or a general equilibrium theorist means by an equilibrium concept. So well, wait a second. What that means, I take it back. That's what an economist means by a description of the environment. It's a description of who decides what when. So for me, that's an institutional framework. And then the equilibrium concept, I'm just going to use Nash equilibrium or a competitive equilibrium or a subgame perfection. And all that means is it's a collection of agents in a coherent environment. Because some agents' decisions are impinging on the environment of other agents. So that's the notion of coherence. Okay, so the Articles of Confederation, when I as an economist read history, the Articles of Confederation are a coherent environment, and they're designed, the people that set them up said, we want a weak center. So there was a very weak center. The center could not tax. Well, it could tax. What it could do is it could ask the 13 states to make contributions. It's a huge free rider problem. And the 13 states usually said, no. Why doesn't New York do it? And Virginia said, why doesn't New York do it? New York said, why doesn't Virginia do it? So the consequence is that in the 1780s, under our first Constitution, we had a central government that had very limited ability to raise taxes. Okay, now, following, I have to tell you one more initial condition. So for me, 1780s is times zero. Another initial condition, when we fought the war, so these 13 states, very weak states, fought this war against the most powerful nation in the world, Great Britain. And the way the states did it is the 13 states issued paper money, and the 13 states borrowed, and they issued IOUs. And furthermore, the central government issued IOUs. Some of these IOUs were bought by, it matters who buys these IOUs. Who owns the debt is important. These IOUs were purchased, the British didn't buy any for some reason. The French bought a little bit, and the Dutch bought a little bit, and the rest were bought by American citizens. So about 3/4 or 80% of this debt was bought by Americans in various states. So now there's one question you should ask me, especially if you live in Spain or Italy, or in what currency were these IOUs denominated in? Well, they were denominated in dollars. What was a dollar? It's a Spanish silver coin. So the United States chose, I'm in Spain. The United States chose to be in a monetary union with Spain. We did not ask Spain. American merchants in the private sector had decided that when they wrote contracts, they were going to be denominated in these silver coins. Spain made no promise to bail us out. It couldn't care less. Just like today, the United States is in a, did you know the United States is in a monetary union with both Panama and Zimbabwe? Both of those countries use US dollars. I'll make you a bet, as much as I admire him, that President Obama doesn't even know that we're in a monetary union with Zimbabwe. We have no promise to bail them out. And that's the situation in the 1780s. Okay, so now I need an equation. Okay, so what determines the value of government debt? What determines the value of government debt in the 1780s? So you know this. It's one equation. Well, it's one equation. It's a differential equation or difference equation that we can solve forward or backward. So you know what I mean? First year macro, you solve this, and the equation that you solve is the government budget constraint. When you solve it backward, you understand that large government debt signifies that you've spent more in the past than you've raised in taxes. Taxes broadly construed, including explicit taxes, income taxes, excise taxes. In those days, there was one tax that raised a lot of revenue, tariffs. In those days, the tariff raised the most revenue. And there's another way you can raise taxes. You can default. You can tax the holders of capital, or you can tax the holders of your bonds. So if you have large government debt today, it means you didn't do those things in the past. That's solving the equation backwards. Well, bondholders don't care. Did you look at the news earlier this week? Bondholders don't care about solving it backwards. They don't read that part of macro 1. They solve forward. And the equation there says that the value of government debt is the discounted present value of government surpluses. So what the IMF calls primary surpluses. So the present value of those surpluses, taxes minus expenditures on things other than servicing the debt, that's what the value of the debt is. So that's the equation that every bondholder is looking at. And you could say, discounted at what rate? Beautiful question. At the stochastic discount factor, where you're taking into account the risk of the taxes and the risk of the government expenditures. So you go into the United States in the 1780s. And remember, this is not a pipe. This is not about the euro. You go into this 1780s, and what you'd find is I'm going to compute the value of the U.S. government debt, and I'll take the ratio to GDP in the 1780s. If I value the debt at par, that means I pretend like these things are really going to be paid. All these promises in silver dollars are going to be paid. It's 40% of GDP. Now you could say, but 40% of GDP, this is a very poor country that has, at its best, the ability to raise revenues of 1% of GDP, or 0.5% of GDP. So if you do the math, that debt cannot go in the market at par. So instead what happened is, in the 1780s, the U.S. government debt and the debt of the 13 states was going at 10 or 20 cents on the dollar. It was going at deep discount. And the reason is, well, there were repeated efforts to get the center to have enough revenues to service the debt. And what would happen repeatedly is the central government would, I could tell you the history of this. It's either a glorious, if you're a small government person, or a depressing history, where time and again the central government tries to fix the problem of debt going at deep discount by raising taxes. And all of these measures are defeated. So in the 1780s, there's 13 states. They have the power to The debt is distributed like this. About 2/3 of the debt is due from the center. Think about Europe. And about 1/3 is in the states, and it's all going at deep discount. The states have the ability to do the one big tax, and it's the tariff. Center has no ability. And finally, there's one other thing. Britain is discriminating against U.S. trade. After the revolution, they said, you want to be separate? You're separate. You're outside of the U.S., the British imperial system, and we're going to discriminate against your trade. We used to let you use American ships if you traded with us. Now you have to use British ships. You cannot ship American goods to various ports. And so Americans of all political stripes said, the British shouldn't be doing this to us. We should retaliate against the British as a united country. But you don't have a united country. You've got 13 states. So what would happen is there were times when Massachusetts tried to retaliate against British trade. And what would happen is neighboring states would not retaliate because it was good business for them. It was great for Rhode Island. So Nash equilibrium. You had the Nash equilibrium. You couldn't retaliate. And so there were various people in the 1780s who, so there's a big debate in the 1780s, and it is very close. There are some people like, I fashion Ronald Reagan being one of them, the old Ronald Reagan, not the young Ronald Reagan. Young Ronald Reagan was a very big state person. Old Ronald Reagan isn't. The old Ronald Reagan would say, this institution is working great. We designed a set of institutions to have a government a central government that can't tax, spend, or borrow. So guess what? It tried to borrow, and the debt's going at deep discount. The institutions are working. Then there's other people who were creditors of the government who wanted that debt that was going at 10 or 20 cents at the dollar. The reason they bought it is they thought it might go up. So they wanted a bigger state that had the ability to tax and borrow. So in the 1780s, there's a question: is there a fiscal crisis in the United States? Okay, so there's a rule. It's an empirical law from Milton Friedman. Problems get fixed. Well, it's an American law. The United States government will only address a problem after it's become a crisis. That's his law. So now the question is, was there a fiscal crisis in the 1780s? Well, from the point of view of the taxpayers who didn't own debt, maybe you'd say not. But from the point of view of the creditors of the government, you'd say there was a crisis. So here's what happened. There was a second American Revolution. That's not how it's described in history books, because there was a peaceful second revolution. And what it was, the people we call our framers or our founding fathers, they got together in secret behind closed doors, and they rewrote the Constitution. And what the Constitution is, what I mean by Constitution again is a description of who decides what when in a coherent environment. They rewrote it, and they were committing treason. This isn't how it's taught in high school. They were committing treason because they were sworn to protect a former the old Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation had a description of how you would amend it. The way you would amend it is you would get unanimous consent from all 13 states for any change. And there were repeated attempts to amend it to give the central government more power to tax. They were always defeated. So what happened, it's a long story, is a bunch of our founding fathers met in secret in Philadelphia behind closed doors. They swore that they would never say what they did behind those closed doors until after all of them were dead. And with one exception, that promise was kept. 45 people kept that promise. So what they did is people asked, what are those guys meeting behind closed doors? The reason they said was, we're going to suggest some amendments to the Articles of Confederation. That's not what they did. At day one, they tore up the Articles of Confederation, and they said, we're going to rewrite the Constitution. And there's a Marxist interpretation of this that was written by Charles Beard in 1900, and it is that the creditors of the U.S. government got together and they reconstituted the government to make their credits good. And I'm not a Marxist, but on this occasion, I am, because that's what they did. And here's how they did it. Their reasoning is described very well by a 33-year-old kid, Alexander Hamilton, who's the first Secretary of Treasury. So, together with the Constitution and the first Congress of the United States, they rearrange institutions, and they do brilliant. It's beyond mechanism design. It's political economy. So, what the U.S. Constitution does is it takes the main tax away from the 13 states, and it gives it to the center. So the U.S. Constitution says states cannot issue tariffs, and the tariff is the monopoly of now the central government. So if the central government wants to tax, it can. The states cannot. Furthermore, the states cannot regulate foreign trade. So now the United States central government has the ability, if it wants, to retaliate against the British. And this was done by the people who met behind Philadelphia were agreed. These weren't debatable. They agreed they wanted the central government to tax, and they wanted it to tax sufficiently to service the U.S. government debt, the U.S. government debt. And they wanted that because, I'll come back to that. They wanted it. I'll ask why in a second. And then here's the second thing that the first acts of Congress did is, one of the first things Congress did is, by the way, we're still in a monetary union with Spain. So the currency is still the dollar. All this is with the dollar, Spanish dollar. So, there's a question. Do you have to have a fiscal union before a monetary union, or can you have a monetary union before? We had a monetary union the whole time. We had a no fiscal union, and we had debt that was, going at deep discount. Nobody was bailing us out. So historically and theoretically, you can do that. Okay, so now the question is this, and read Alexander Hamilton on why he says he's going to do this. So what happens is there's a grand bargain made. And this was understood at the time that the Constitution was written. The grand bargain was the federal government, the central government, is going to completely bail out the debt of all the states. Remember I told you all the 13 states had debt that was going at various discounts? The first Congress completes the grand bargain, and it says we're going to assume or bail out or nationalize or you're going to nationalize or assume the debt of all the 13 states. So that state debt of Virginia or New York became the debt, became U.S. government debt. And why did they do that? Hamilton says why he's going to do that. He wants to realign interests. He wants to convert the creditors of the states to become creditors of the U.S. government. And the reason he wants to do that is he wants those creditors they're mostly Americans, he wants them to become advocates of a strong central government that's going to support the tariffs that are sufficient to service their debt. So he's realigning, this question of who decides what when, the simple economic concept. And Hamilton realizes that there's no dictator, and what's going to happen is going to be voters, and there's going to be lobbyists. He wants the most important lobbyists, mainly the moneyed interests that own this state debt, who wanted, in the old days, they'd be advocates of a strong state government taxing to service their debt. He wants them to become advocates of a strong central government. So this is all about moving sovereignty, fiscal sovereignty from the states to the center, and realigning interests, because he realizes democracy. He wants to realign interests so that voters are going to do the things that are going to service the debt. So it's very sophisticated. So you could say, economists can stand up here and say, oh, it's really easy to fix this debt crisis that the United States had. Just start paying your debts. Just start taxing more. Well, that's vacuous. Of course, it's true. It's because it's respecting that present value, but it's ignoring the politics. Well, George Washington and Alexander Hamilton didn't ignore the politics, and they couldn't. They were rearranging the interests so that you got away from Ronald Reagan's dream to the construction of a government that could tax, spend, and borrow. And it could borrow because it had the ability to tax and spend. So, they rewrote the Constitution, and guess what? It worked. That government debt that was going at 10 or 20 cents on the dollar, quickly in 1790 and 1791, at the beginning of our country, it went from 10 and 20 cents on the dollar to a par. So if you had bought this debt at 10 or 20 cents on the dollar, you would have made a killing. So let me take a little digression here, because so what happened was this reconstructed set of institutions. You look at the government arithmetic. A tariff is imposed. The tax revenues of the federal government, and actually the aggregate of the governments, goes up. Almost half of the tax revenues is used to service the debt. Imagine that. There's no entitlements in those days. So they're taxing in order to honor their debt. There's a really interesting thing that happened at the time. So George Stigler, a great economist in Chicago, said the following. He said, "A war can ravage half a continent and raise no new issues in economic theory." So you can ask, are all the events that are going on in the world today, in Europe and the United States, is there anything new theoretically? Stigler would say no. So here's a little example. When George Washington and Alexander Hamilton say that they're going to they're going to fund this debt, and they're going to pay all the debt, one of our founding fathers, James Madison, says, wait a minute, we should pay the debt, but the way you're doing it is unfair. It's unfair. And here's the reason it's unfair. You're giving people that bought this debt at 10 or 20 cents on the dollar, you're paying them at par. And this debt itself has a history. Originally, Albert bought the debt at par sometime during the war, and then he got cold feet as things kind of went, and he sold it at 50 cents on the dollar to Raphael. And then Raphael sold it, at 10 cents on the dollar to Jesus. And those guys are out of it. And what the United States government is going to do is going to give Jesus $1 for his 10 cents. And James Madison said, that's not fair. He said, what you should do, now there's a little bit of record keeping that would be involved in this. The U.S. government is going to give Jesus 10 cents. Now, I have dyslexia, and I can't do math fast. It's going to give Raphael 40. And it's going to give Albert 50. So that they all got what they originally thought they would get if there was no risk. And that's fair. That's called discrimination. He wanted to discriminate. Go back and take away any capital gains or capital losses. And that had support of almost half the Congress. That seems fair. And Alexander Hamilton, this 33-year-old kid, by the way, he learned economics by reading 2 or 3 books while he's fighting a war. This guy's really smart. And he really thought about what he read. What he said is, wait a minute, 2 things. Think about it. Why do you want to pay the debt in the first place? And is this the way you want to pay it? Because what he wants to do is he wants to create a liquid market in U.S. government debt in which people think it's tradable. And if they buy it, they think they're actually buying what the claim is. And he says this discrimination scheme is going to kill that. If we do this, forget about U.S. government debt ever being liquid. And then the second thing he says, oh, by the way, you want to talk about fairness? Let's actually talk about fairness. Albert and Raphael, they bailed out. they lost faith in the U.S. government, and they bailed out. And Jesus, he had faith. He was speculating there would be a capital gain. He took a big risk, but he put his money down. He's the guy who had faith in the United States. Who's fair? So Hamilton has this beautiful discussion of this. You could give this to undergraduates or to your mother. Like I tried. To teach about actually thinking about what it means to be fair, because it's subtle. Anyway, so this is what was done. Okay, now there's two big questions here that were running through the 1780s. And think of Stigler's phrase, does a crisis like a war really raise any new issues in theory? Or is it a working out of things that the theory was talking about? So there's kind of two questions that this U.S. Episode underlies. One is, should a government pay its debts? And the second question is, should a central government bail out or pay the debts of subordinate governments? So these are enduring questions these are just enduring questions. And there's kind of two answers, yes, no, 2 times, there's 4 answers. So Hamilton gave the answer, yes, yes. So there's pros and cons on both sides. Okay, so let's take the first one. Should a government pay its debts? The obvious answer is no. Why should you ever pay the debts? Because you're going to have to levy taxes now that don't finance government expenditures. You're going to have to levy taxes on some people and then turn around and give it to some people that you already got money back from. They gave you money to finance past government expenditures. So why should you pay them now? It's a great thing to do, to default on the debt, because you get something for nothing. So the obvious answer is you shouldn't pay the debt. And the Ronald Reagan guys were saying that. Yeah, we already fought the war. And they said things like this. Look, we fought the war. The soldiers lost their lives and their arms and legs. What's so bad about what Hayes is losing his money? That's what they said. And Hamilton said, wait, that's not right. And it's not right for a sophisticated reason. And what is it? We want to pay the debt now to gain a reputation for paying our debt because we might want to borrow in the future. And if we don't pay our debt now, we won't be able to borrow in the future. People will just regard us as we didn't say this in those days, a banana republic that just doesn't pay its debts. We want a good reputation. And the United States was a basket case. It was like the most irresponsible government in any continent you could think of. Our debt was going at 10 or 20 cents on the dollar. He said, I want to not be like that. I want to be like Britain, which is a country that had a reputation for paying its debts. Why? Because I might want to borrow in the future. I might want to tax smooth. And he says this. And he says, I actually don't want to maybe pay the debt off, but I want to honor the existing debt, roll it over. And so that is what the United States does. And the United States, and why does he want to borrow in the future? He thinks that we might have future wars, God forbid, or we might have opportunities that are put onto us that we want to take advantage of. So the United States takes Hamilton's advice, and I don't know if you know, but 10 years later, an opportunity came. One of your neighbors, Napoleon Bonaparte, offered the United States a deal. Basically, he said, I'll sell you Louisiana, which would double the United States for $25 million. The U.S. didn't have the $25 million. We borrowed it. And it was easy to borrow it because we had paid our debt before. So that's the tension that Hamilton was, why pay your debts? Just pros and cons. The question is, why should you bail out subordinate governments? And Hamilton said yes. But he said it for a reason. He gave his reason. I want to bail out the subordinate governments because I want to redesign and realign the interests of the voters and the creditors, and I want to make the creditors. I want to use this as an occasion. This crisis is an occasion to strengthen the center. So I want to bail out the states explicitly as part of this grand bargain, so that the central government will acquire more power to tax and regulate. And he's upfront about it. Okay. So I want to fast forward. So that's how the United States created a fiscal union. And then, so there's a lot of people say you have to have a fiscal union before a monetary union. United States history doesn't say that. Because about a year after we created this fiscal union and did this and rescheduled our debt, the debt is still denominated in dollars, Hamilton submitted another proposal. He said, the proposal was this, actually, we should have our own dollars. We should have our own monetary standard. And actually, the Congress says that, the Constitution says that Congress is supposed to set up the monetary standard. So we do this after we solve the debt problem. And here's how we solve it. What we say is, you know those Spanish coins? They have the picture of, I don't know what they had, the King of Spain, maybe, and some animal. I don't know. I actually don't. I don't know what it looked like. So they said, we can't have that. So we're going to make a coin that says United States of America, and it's going to have an eagle on it, and something else, some lady. And what it's going to do, it's going to have exactly the silver content of the Spanish dollar. And that's going to be the US dollar. In other words, we're going to copy the Spanish dollar. So that's our monetary system. So for an economist, you know about Modigliani Miller? Economist said this is a sideshow. It's just who gets the advertising on the coin? Why should Spain get free advertising? Or we can advertise the US. That's the whole deal. Okay, so that's how the United States fiscal and monetary system was born, and it was born of a revolution. And I've chosen this nonviolent revolution to talk about this. I could actually, and I've tried to illustrate this, that fiscal crises produce often political revolutions. I can give you another example. It's a more exciting example. I didn't give you this example because I don't want us to lose our heads about this. Well, the other example is the French Revolution. And if you read the history of the French Revolution and you read it what I think is the right way, it was provoked by a fiscal crisis. And you can read the events of the French Revolution as being the working out of solving the fiscal crisis. And if you want a reference on that, I'll tell you about it. Okay, so in my last, I think I have 10 minutes, or a few minutes. So here's where I want to go. So then there's the message here. Even if you have George Washington and Hamilton, you don't work things out once and for all. So I just fast forward a little bit. So we had this fiscal union, and then the states had been bailed out. And then what happened was Hamilton and scheme worked so well, we actually ended up paying off most of the federal debt. We honored it. Everything worked like a charm. And we had this central government that could raise revenues. Now the question is, what should it do? So you have to remember, this is a poor country. We don't have various expenditures that welfare states have today. We didn't have medical expenditures of any size. And why? Because it was bad to go to doctors. Doctors hurt you. It was better that you didn't go to doctors. The other thing is we didn't have retirement systems. And do you know why? Because nobody lived as long as I've lived. The life expectancy is like 48, and you work, and then you stop working, and you stop living at the same time. That's the situation. So we had small government, a fraction of GDP. So it's a different. So the United States government now had this revenue-raising machine, and so the question is, what should it do? Now there's technological advances at that time. So So you could build infrastructure. So there's proposals to build infrastructure. What infrastructure? Roads, canals, and railroads. So there's proposals to use federal money to finance those, but it turns out a sequence of presidents said that was unconstitutional. But the federal constitution prohibited that. There's a case for it. And it's because the federal government couldn't finance things that went across state lines. So now you have all these quite risky infrastructure projects that that the private sector wants done, but doesn't want to do it itself. Okay, so one other fact. You may know, commentators in the press will always tell you this, you may know that in the United States today, the 50 states, we have 50 states, almost every one of those states has a constitution, has a state constitution that prohibits those states from running deficits. They have to run year-by-year balanced budgets, not because the federal government told them. The federal government says, you do what you want. It's none of their business. It would be unconstitutional for the federal government to tell them what to do. There's no central fiscal rules that are imposed on the states. But the states themselves have state constitutions that say we must balance the budget year by year. And those are by the way, those are bad. Because if you think governments should actually borrow and tax smooth, you shouldn't balance the budget year by year. You should run surpluses in good times and deficits in bad times. But states are prohibited from doing that, and that matters. But we have those laws in the states. Why? It's another example of the situation of the dictum that fiscal crises often produce political revolutions. So here's what happens. At the beginning, state constitutions did not require balanced budgets. States could run, at the beginning, in the 1790s, 1800s, 1810s, 1820s, 1830s, states could run unbalanced budgets, and they did. And here's what they did. To finance canals and railroads, state governments ran deficits. So the states issued bonds, and the bonds were used to lend money in turn to railroads and so on. So there was a huge amount of debt was issued in this way. It's not the debt of the federal government; it's the debt of the state governments. And so now I have to tell you who bought this debt. Okay, a minority was actually bought by Americans. 70% of it was bought by British citizens. So the British citizens. Now you can ask, why did the British citizens buy that debt? So remember the logic behind Hamilton's proposal, the original proposal. Okay, so 70% of this debt's bought by British people, and by the way, you should, if you're going to buy debt, you should read. You need a lawyer to tell you. You're buying sovereign debt. They thought they were buying sovereign debt. They're buying the debt of the state of Michigan, not of the United States. So they could go ask their lawyer, and the lawyer might say, it's fine, because go read the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution says states must pay their debts. Investor protection. They must honor their debts. But we have amendments. The 11th Amendment to the Constitution, which was passed immediately, it says, if you're a resident of another state or of a foreign country and you have a claim against a state government, you cannot take that claim to a federal court. You have to take it to a state court. And that amendment was put in very rapidly to take investor protection away from people who weren't residents of the state. That was put there. So Americans understood that. Not everybody else did. They should have. So here's what happened. Guess what? In the 1830s, there's all these state debts out. There's not much federal debt. Actually, there's zero federal debt. It's been paid off. So the U.S. debt, which these British guys are buying, it's huge. Okay, there's a financial crisis. A bunch of these railroads and canals go belly up. They stop paying their. So what the states do And the creditors of the government do is they go to the Congress, and they say, okay, you bailed us out once, bail us out again. And there's a congressional debate, and it goes both ways. And it's actually an exciting debate to read. And I think the real reasons are never given. So here's some of the reason if you read the congressional debates. Some people say, we did it before, we do it again, honor, stuff like that, Hamilton. Other people say, wait a minute. We did it the last time because most of that debt was incurred in a common cause to fight the British, the war. This debt, Michigan's debt, was incurred to build a railroad in Michigan. That's not common at all. So what happens is, but then the real reason is, most of the debt's owned by the British, and they don't get to vote. So what happens is the federal government does not bail them out. And the debts of many of these states are repudiated, and the British are really mad. The international capital markets are really mad, and they punish the United States both with the state debt and the federal debt for a generation. And this has several consequences. So it has several consequences. One is states rewrite their constitutions to require balanced budgets year by year. There's a flurry of rewriting of constitutions, and for me, within a state, that's a political revolution, meaning redesigning who decides what, when, under what information. So there was a consequence of this failure to bail out. So I guess the way you can think about it is there's a story of two bailouts, or where the federal government was asked to bail out. There's other stories in the United States that are really interesting too. But these two salient stories, the federal government gave different answers to the second question, should you bail out subordinate governments? The first time they did it, in order to create a reputation with international creditors that the United States would pay its debt, international and domestic creditors. But they did it at the cost of a reputation with the state governments that the federal government would bail them out again. These guys didn't use the word moral hazard, but they knew about it. And so the state governments and so the moral who would know about the moral hazard issue is like. So the British, if you're a British creditor, you think, well, this is backed not only by the state of Michigan, but by the federal government. And what they learned was, well, that was true in the 1780s, but you guys didn't take the opportunity to buy U.S. debt then. You bought it in the 1830s, and it's not backed by the federal government anymore. So what happened is, the United States, the story about reputation is, we built a reputation in 1790 by paying our debt, but we built two reputations. We'd pay our federal debt and we'd bail out state governments. And then what happened was, in the 1840, we tried to fine-tune the reputation. That, don't worry, the federal government's going to pay its debt. We don't have any. But the federal government is not going to pay state debts. And it turned out we couldn't fine-tune that reputation. So that's the end of my story. So you'll recognize the story is sort of organized. So like when I read history, or I think when almost any economist reads history, you read history, you're hit by all these facts, and so I'm doing this kind of pattern recognition, and I'm picking facts that kind of are reminding me of stuff that's going on today, and you'll notice as I pick the facts. I'm picking different facts than an art historian or a historian of religion would pick. There's lots of stuff going on with religion at the time. People are getting less, they're more faithful, and maybe that's making them more honest and wanting to pay their debts. I don't forget that. I'm just looking at these government budget constraints and the interests and who the voters are and who pays the debts. So these stories kind of bring you, is it the history's telling me this in pushing this in my face, or am I pushing this on the history? You know, so like you'll see kind of a cynical. I say, why did the U.S. bail out in 1790 and not? Does it matter who owns the debt? And I guess, does it matter who owns the debt and whether we're going to default? And I just say, I really hope there's nobody from China that's listening to my story.